Hello and welcome to our Mathematic Cybersecurity Roundtable discussion today. Really excited for this conversation. My name is Nicole Owens. I'm the Director of Marketing Communications at Mathematic. If you're not familiar with us, we are a membership-based trade association that works to bolster the industry in Massachusetts and New England through education, events like this, advocacy, awareness, and connection. We have a great conversation today, but before I turn it over to our moderator, I do have a few housekeeping notes. And I would like to thank our sponsors for today. BDO, Benchmark, and Intertech are bringing you today's content. So a few housekeeping notes. Today's webinar is being recorded, so everyone who registered for the roundtable today will receive a copy of the recording, as well as the slides that are going to be shared today. We do have time for Q&A, so as we go through the conversation, if something occurs to you that you'd like to ask, please feel free to put it in the Q&A function at the bottom of the screen, and we'll do our best to get to that question as time allows. Without further ado, I am pleased to turn over the conversation to today's moderator, Mark Antalik from BDO. Mark, take it away.
Awesome. Thank you, Nicole. So I agree, we have an amazing session planned today with a bunch of esteemed professionals from the medtech industry. As Nicole mentioned, I'll be moderating the panel. We do have a pretty packed agenda. We'll start with some introductions. Then George Strom from Intertech is going to do a short presentation on regulatory and cybersecurity requirements. And then we'll move into our panel discussion and we'll wrap up with some Q&A. So in terms of introductions, my name is Mark Antalik. I'm located in Boston, and I'm a principal in BDO's Privacy and Data Protection Group, where I help to lead our data privacy and data governance services. And I've been in the space now for about 25 years, really helping clients deal with data from a few different perspectives, from digital forensics and electronic discovery through to information lifecycle management and data governance and data privacy. And I started my career with the government, went on to work at 2 large law firms, and I've been in professional services for about a dozen years now. And over the course of the last decade or so, I've developed a specialty around life sciences and medtech, and are really helping those organizations understand and protect their data and help to make sure that they're in compliance with all the related laws and regulations, and there are a lot of them. So it's great to be here today. Let me turn it over to Dustin Eastman for the next intro.
Thanks, Mark. So Dustin Eastman, I work for Medtronic. I'm the Director of Product Security for our surgical operating unit. Previous to becoming the Director of Product Security, I was a distinguished product security engineer, where I worked on projects such as the Hugo robotic assisted surgery system and other surgical equipment in my tenure with Medtronic. So I've been with Medtronic for now going on 18 years. I actually started as an intern with Tyco Healthcare that later became Covidian, and we were acquired by Medtronic in 2015. And I've been in roles ranging from operations, test engineering, advanced manufacturing engineering, system engineering, and then in the last 7 or 8 years, product security. And I've been part of well over a dozen medical device product releases. And currently my team, who's is based out of Boston, Virginia, Israel, is working with cross-functional teams to ensure that our products meet cybersecurity and data privacy, regulatory, and customer expectations. So now I'll pass it over to Jerediah.
Hello, Jerediah Welty. I'm a staff software engineer at Benchmark, Benchmark Inc. Used to be Benchmark Electronics. We're a contract manufacturing and engineering firm servicing a wide variety of industries and markets, but I've primarily been in the medical space for about the last 10 years now. Work with a wide number of startups and big players. We help all our customers to bring their products from concept to realization. I've been working in the last several years, focused real heavily on the cybersecurity, helping our customers to prepare for their FDA submissions for their 510Ks, and just helping to build better products as they're getting ready for market. And I think George is next.
Good morning, everyone. George Strom with Intertech. Thank you so much for sharing your morning with all of us. I've been with Intertek since 1995, and it's been a very interesting ride, if you would, with Intertek. I started working in the electrical business unit, providing manufacturers with product safety and EMC testing solutions, as well as performance testing, and also spent time with our auditing group and our business assurance group. About 7 years ago, we formed, via acquisition, a group called Connected World, and it brought us right to the forefront of product-based cybersecurity, as Intertek acquired 3 distinct organizations providing varying degrees of product cybersecurity. 2 of those are based in North America, and 1 is based in the United Kingdom. And the 2 in North America, well, from a legacy perspective, were really dialed in on common criteria, as well as FIPS validation. And upon acquisition, we took a deep dive into what industry would be impacted directly by product-based cybersecurity. And it was clear it was the medical device arena. And over the past 6-7 years, we spent the majority of our time working directly with manufacturers to understand the impact that their supply chain was having with requests for penetration testing, if you would, as well as what the regulators are asking. And it's been a very interesting ride. And so hopefully today I provide you some good insight of what we're seeing from a request perspective from our clients, but also some of the changing landscape that's happening from a regulatory perspective.
That's awesome. Thank you all so much. I wasn't lying when I said we have an esteemed group of professionals here. So thank you again, everybody, for taking the time today. So speaking of you, George, I know you put together a short presentation on regulatory and cybersecurity requirements. So I think that's a great way to kick things off today. So if you want to kind of take it away, that'd be great.
Absolutely. So thank you so much, everybody. As I said, George Strahm with Intertek. I work with the Connected World business unit. And it's been, I have to say, for the past 28 years, such an interesting ride to be in. When I started, you were somebody if you had a 900 megahertz cordless phone. So think about how technology has advanced over the course of a generation. And when I look at, the global landscape and how it's changed, it certainly is something that we all have to take a look at. All the different countries that have launched a framework for product-based cybersecurity. And this is something that's very different and there's nuances in every location. And it's interesting to have dialogue with manufacturers as they say, well, I've received this letter from, say, the FDA, or my notified body says I need to meet the new essential requirements for the MDR. And then trying to understand each nuance in every situation, as every manufacturer is at a different part of their journey. And it's probably the best advice I could give you is don't be intimidated by these new requirements. Our understanding from an Intertek perspective is that every manufacturer is different. As my mother-in-law would say, we're all different flowers in the garden. So we have to understand where we are in that journey. It's certainly an amazing time. And, they're all questions are good questions, right? So don't think you're going to embarrass yourself because every question is a good question. We have a wealth of knowledge here. So certainly, probably the most intriguing document that I'm seeing out there is the IMDRF document. I think that's something that if you read through that document, it has tremendous, connectivity through many countries. So as we go through this, if there's questions specific to any of these, please raise your hand. I would say that, where we sit today, and this is outside of the FDA, all the deep dive in the FDA new requirements as well. So please be patient with me. What we're seeing today, these are probably the 5 countries, really, if you go the European Union as a country, knowing that it's not, that we're getting questions on from our clients. So I took a look at all the inquiries we're getting from our marketing perspective, all of my dialogue and my email trails to figure out where the traction was coming from. And really, I think the one most intriguing that got the most requests this year was Japan, which had an announcement probably in April timeframe, which ironically coincided with a trip for me to Japan, was that they were now requiring a penetration test, and they're really looking at this IEC 81000-5-1. And that standard is very intriguing as it became very pervasive in all the framework by these 5 countries. And as one of the major questions I've always received the past 6 or 7 years from our clients is, what's the standard? I think Intertek has done a very good job at providing a conditioned response or coaching our clients to give a conditioned response. What is the standard? And when there was no true standard that was harmonized or consensus standard that was out there, it was a very difficult conversation because everyone was like, well, tell me when the standard becomes relevant. What I like about this particular standard and what I like about the requirement is that it's a derivative of the IEC 62443 standard, which has long been a standard for industrial automation. And that particular standard really looks at the security levels and understanding it goes back to the risk-based approach, which I think everyone is very familiar with from a product safety perspective. And that risk-based approach really is understanding what is the risk of my product when it's used, what is the risk if I'm hacked, and what would the risk be to the patient, right? That's ultimately, you don't want to create harm to the patient, right? Obviously, that's obviously opens up a whole Pandora's box for any legal people on the call, but also for your legal counsel, you don't want to harm the patient. I think that's pretty straightforward, methodology to have. But also, it really, understanding that there's a process to cybersecurity, and it's not just the testing. It's not just understanding I have to do a vulnerability assessment and I have to do a penetration test. It is the process of treating your software like a component, is the best analogy I could give you. How do you understand, who made the changes, when they made the changes, why they made the changes? Is it documented? And that's a critical mass that you have to understand, because there's nuances in every country to that. And understanding how you patch your software is also very critical. I did have a manufacturer about 4 or 5 years ago who told me point blank and looked me right in the eye, said, George, I'm going to act like we didn't have this conversation, and this topic's going to go away. I'm here to tell you right now that playing ostrich to cybersecurity is not the best strategy. I think that's a pretty straightforward approach. I see a wry smile on Dustin's as he lives this every day. You have to have a strategy. And I firmly believe if you're a startup, you have to have a starting point. If you're a Fortune 50 company, you have to have a strategy. You have to understand where you are in your journey. You have to sustain your journey, and you have to have, in my opinion, some objective evidence to sustain your journey. And that comes with test reports. And I think that's very critical. I think a lot of manufacturers, they want to do it themselves. That's fine. But can you create that firewall between the developer and the tester so that you do have that firewall to prove that the tester isn't the developer? Obviously, you want to have a separation there. So as you go through each of these, and there's nuances in each one, feel free to ask questions. But I find it very intriguing that there is a standard that's being referenced, and there's also an FDA consensus standard for all those persons worried about the FDA, as we are located in the United States. And here's a good snapshot of the actual standard themselves. I think that when you walk through this, you're really looking at the life cycle of it, how you designed it, how you build it, how it really dovetails from your software bill of materials through a vulnerability assessment. What guidelines do you have? If you have defect management, the product end of life, right? There's also a great document, just as a point of reference, that the IMDRF came out with this year on how to end a life of product based on how long you're support it. So something to look into. I can share that with you offline. It's not part of this deck, but it's certainly something that's out there for consideration for manufacturers. But when you go through this particular standard, you realize it does take into account the design of the software. It takes into account how you do that verification and validation, which is consistent with the European Union. And the verification and validation is actually the testing, how they refer to it in the EU. And then it looks at that patch management. So certainly something to consider for all of us on this call. I do want to spend probably 5 minutes on the FDA. I think this is the one we're getting outside of Japan. This is obviously when I wrote this presentation, it was number 2. Now it's percolated number 1 with the amount of requests and inquiries we're getting over the past week, which are really, really intriguing, because while we've coached people, and we did a webinar earlier this year centric to the full pre-market requirements in draft format that was passed from the omnibus bill earlier this year, this particular version is far more, it's concise from the draft guidance in March or April this year. And it's certainly something, we have clients who are now really very nervous because they haven't done and have managed to the process of cybersecurity. While they've done some testing, they haven't gone and looked at the elements of the process. And one element that I find most intriguing in the guidance document is the reference to this IEC 62443 and secure product development framework. And this is an excellent standard where the manufacturer goes through and they start to document, as an organization, you look at, as an organization, how we build our software. And then you take that organizational control and you apply it to a product. And I think that is very critical, because you don't want to have separate processes, or you probably shouldn't, best practice, have multiple processes on how you build your software and create your framework for your software. It should be very structured in an area that has long, the criticality and the criticism was that there wasn't a structure to the software. It wasn't considered a component. Manufacturers pushed back heavily on regulators as they said, well, how can we do this? You can't change this. It's too radical. And this has been going on, believe it or not, since 2014. So it's been a long dwell time, if you would. But I think the manufacturers have provided some great feedback. They advocated for a couple, consensus standards, and this is really a very strong, document also to leverage. And it also, in my opinion, can springboard into the 80,001 series. So one of the real, I found most intriguing in the testing section of the guidance document was the disclaimer that the device manufacturer should indicate in the test reports by whom the testing was performed and the level of independence, the tester had from the developer. And this really is intriguing. While they're not openly saying you need a third party, they're not saying that. They're saying if you want to use the third party, that's good enough, but make sure you have a firewall. But they're also saying, and we've seen tech files kick back with corrective actions because A, they had no test data on the USB ports and no fuzzing done or a malformed input test. They had no test data on cloud connectivity, which is a big concern. Obviously, that's a concern when you think about all the devices that historically are now residing in the home when previously they weren't in the home. But with the pandemic, we saw traditional hospital care equipment now reside in the home, and all the risk factors of having, say, a Bluetooth device that's going to try to pair by nature with every Bluetooth device in its environment. And so that really, you have to understand what the threat is for that device and what type of testing you've done. So the FDA really is asking for a manufacturer to go through, understand the threats, understands the, the threat to the patient, understand how they can update that software and the patchability, because your ecosystem is now, if you have a mobile application, you have cloud connectivity, you have the device, you are responsible as the manufacturer to update those and provide a plan how you're going to update those and mitigate the vulnerabilities if they become a threat level. And that's where that independent testing certainly comes through, that if you have a vulnerability, say via the NIST known vulnerabilities database, what are you going to do to mitigate that risk? Do you remove it? Or do you put hardening around it? To be determined based on the manufacturer, based on the functionality of that vulnerability. So all software has vulnerabilities. It's not saying you have a bad software, it's just that be aware that there's some things out there for from a software perspective that you should be cognizant of. And the other real critical thing that I find is probably the number one question I get from all of our clients is, what is a software bill of materials? And I always go back to the Lego bricks. While a bit, maybe overplayed, but as a dad, I can tell you I've stepped on a million Legos and they really hurt. So it brought right to the forefront. Oh, now I understand what they want from software bill of materials. You have your operating system, your device drivers, any open source libraries, and obviously your vendor code. And what you have to provide in that software bill of materials, as an example, is what is the software component name? What's the version of that software? Who manufactured the component? What level of support is provided for that component? And how you're going to end if there's an end of life and any known vulnerabilities. All that is packaged together as part of your submittal to the FDA. But equally, I find that the risk, one of the biggest risks we've encountered is the subcontracting and the development of your software, particularly with mobile applications. And I'm not trying to bemoan any mobile app developers on the call, but we have examples where, the subcontractors will go back to the manufacturer and say, we didn't use any open source libraries for our mobile app, for your mobile app development. When in essence, they've had upwards north of 100 open source libraries in the mobile application. And that represents risk because you are now responsible for that patching. You're now responsible for the vulnerabilities in that mobile application. And that's really, something to pay attention to. When you have your suppliers, make sure you have a robust contract with your suppliers as well. That becomes part of your process because you want to make sure the accountability starts with, it's everyone's responsibility is probably the adage I've heard in a lot of documents I've read about cybersecurity. It's everyone's responsibility in the organization to understand what that means to you and the development of your product and the ecosystem it operates. So with that, I think I took in more than 15 minutes, which I do apologize if I have. I will turn it back over to Mark.
Fantastic. Thank you so much, George. That was awesome. So kind of picking up on that as we roll into our panel discussion, I mean, George really hit on the cybersecurity regulations, and that's the crux of what we're talking about today. I did want to quickly talk about kind of data protection and privacy as really closely related disciplines of cybersecurity. So first, what am I talking about when I say privacy and data protection? So people in the European Union consider privacy to be a fundamental human right. And the reason I mention that is because the big privacy regulation, the one that you've probably heard of, the GDPR, or the General Data Protection Regulation, went into effect about 5 years ago, and it changed everything. It's not just in the EU, but globally for companies that operate in the EU or pretty much have anything to do with data that might be in the EU. Privacy is a fundamental human right. So think about that. Think about that in the context of marketing and advertising technology. And that may only be relevant to some medtech organizations, but I think it'll give everyone a better understanding of kind of what I'm talking about here. So when you're shopping on a website, the website's tracking your activities. You know, what products you're clicking on, how long you're spending looking at certain products. Are you looking at all of the pictures? Did you add something to your shopping cart but not buy it? Did you delete it? That's really powerful information for marketing and advertising. And I'm sure, you know, you've noticed that if you were shopping for something from your phone and then you see an advertisement for that same type of product on your tablet or your laptop or even your TV, that is all not by chance. There's a whole world of things like cookies, beacons, and pixels that are tracking your online activities. And that's really all in an effort to facilitate bidding on your profile and then really serving you up ads that are more targeted and personalized to you. And I'd ask you, are you okay with that? So somebody in the EU is probably going to say, heck no, you know. Historically, our attitude here in the US is to say, oh, yeah, sure, I like this. Maybe it's a little creepy, but it's giving me content and an experience that I'm enjoying. But that process is really starting to change these days here in the US also. And so data protection and privacy, it's all about transparency. So it's telling customers or consumers or patients what you're doing with their data. And the idea is that somebody can go read the public-facing privacy notice for a company, which is on their website or on their app, and really truly understand what the company is collecting about them, how the company is using the data and why they're using it. And then beyond the transparency, there are things called individual rights in the world of privacy. And under GDPR or the California Privacy Rights Act, you can opt out of some of that data collection and processing activities. So say you don't want that type of targeted advertising that I mentioned. You have the right now to opt out of it. You also have the right to call up the company and tell them to delete your information. Those are your individual rights, and there are lots more of them. Now, all of this holds true for medtech. So privacy is a right for your customers and consumers and patients. So think about that in the context of connected devices. I mean, the data might be collected directly from patients, might be transferred to a healthcare provider, might be sent onward to a different medtech company, might be made available to a third-party service provider, you know, might be analyzed to improve performance. People have a right now to understand what data the company is collecting, how the company is using it, how they're keeping it, if they're sharing it with third parties. People have the right to call the company up and ask to delete their information or ask what exactly the company has about them. They have the right to complain to a regulator if they're not satisfied with the company's privacy notice or if they're not happy with the way the company dealt with them when they exercise their rights. And I mentioned GDPR because that's kind of like the gold standard privacy regulation. If you have the right processes, procedures, and documentation in place for GDPR, you should generally be in a good place. But that said, it's definitely not the whole picture. Many countries have their own data protection regulations. They all have nuances. You look at China, PIPL, that went live about 2 years ago, and it's very rigorous. It has very strict requirements for transferring data out of China. So much so that companies like Yahoo and LinkedIn have literally completely shut down in mainland China. Also under PIPL, a lot like GDPR, there are lots of fines for noncompliance, fines up to 5% of global revenue. There's also a notion under PIPL of personal liability and suspension of business licenses. So if that doesn't grab people's attention, it should. And this is all around these data privacy requirements. In the US, you know, so not only do you have to understand the global data privacy landscape, but we may literally wind up with 50 different data protection regulations here in the US too. And a dozen states now have their privacy regulations signed into law. There are 6 more that are introduced and are actually in committee right now. And I mention all of this to kind of piggyback on what George was talking about, but really to demonstrate the point that if you have customers or consumers or patients or operations or partners or employees in any of the states or any global regulations that have these privacy regulations, you really need to know what your obligations are, you know, from a data protection standpoint, or you do risk some regulatory scrutiny. MedTech is a highly regulated space. You know, you're dealing with PII and PHI and cross-border data transfers and international operations. there's going to be more attention paid to you by regulators. Earlier this year, a healthcare company that specialized in telemedicine and discount prescriptions got fined $1.5 million by the FTC for sharing and monetizing private health data with third-party advertisers. It's interesting to me, this came from the FTC. They relied on a 14-year-old health breach notification regulation for enforcement, which is also pretty interesting. So the regulators are paying attention to this stuff. Last thing I want to mention before we get into the panel is the concept of privacy by design. And George kind of hit a little bit on this too. And what that means is making sure that data protection and privacy are really front-loaded into product development, that they're not an afterthought. You know, it's like really truly including privacy, cybersecurity considerations in the SDLC, really designing that into the product. And it's much easier to think about, you know, privacy, cybersecurity in the design phase than it is to bolt on a bunch of measures after the fact. So with George's background, what I was just talking about in terms of kind of the intersection of cybersecurity and privacy, I think let's move on to the panel here. And I think I'm going to start with Dustin on this one. So we've talked a lot about the various requirements from medtech organizations, but why is data protection and cybersecurity particularly challenging in medtech?
Sure. Yeah. So I think George mentioned it. You know, we have this complex ecosystem when it comes to medical devices. More and more medical devices are, integrated in with other devices connected to hospital IT systems and networks, which range in their ability, in varying levels of mitigating cybersecurity risks in those environments. In fact, a recommendation is to treat those environments as hostile. If you are a medical device manufacturer, you'll end up driving better design decisions. But also mentioned is, we're storing data in clouds. We're retrieving device log data. We're pushing software updates. Overall, it's just increasing the potential for vulnerabilities that exist in those attack vectors. The other one, which I think is the one that at least in Medtronic we've had a hard time working through, is the fact that we have a lot of legacy devices, right? And legacy devices, some of our capital equipment devices are expected to last 7, 10. I've seen them be used for over 20 years. So how do you solve that problem? Even if security was considered at the start, those devices, what's secure today isn't secure tomorrow. And so there's a lot of systems out there, both network connected or with connectivity options and capabilities that aren't protected, that have wide open protocols. And what do you do for those? And so I think that adds another layer of complexity there, because devices have a long life cycle. And then you mentioned connectivity, but I think and I think that's important. But I think if you look at the root of like the most recent guidance from the FDA, they're talking about all devices, not just network connected devices. Obviously, there's an increased risk profile with those, but we need to be thinking about how we're doing things better in that arena. And I think we'll talk about that a little bit later. The other one is, all right, you have devices out there and there is a security vulnerability. How do you do patch management? It's not like this is an IoT device. You just, you work in the CI/CD pipeline, you come up with a patch and you roll it out and it goes and updates, you have an updated device. You don't have to worry about that vulnerability anymore on all your devices. The fact is we don't have connectivity under all of our devices. And when we do roll out a patch, we're under those same regulatory obligations and expectations to comply to standards to ensure foremost, right, that our devices are safe and are providing the clinical benefit to the customer. And so there's a lot of verification validation that goes into even a simple update to a device. And so, you know, if a new public vulnerability or a new vulnerability is publicized, our ability to respond to that, if we were just learning about it at the same time, which I think that's another thing we need to request of our suppliers, is getting that information sooner. But we can't just flip a switch and roll out a patch. We have to go through, you know, secure, you know, our software development lifecycle and ensure that it's verified for effectiveness. The other one is, and I'm thinking, I think this is getting better, and George mentioned it, there has generally been a lack of standardization across the industry, both from like a standards perspective. There's been consensus standards that the FDA's had, pulling from the industrial control system stuff, the 81001-5-1, I think is going to be it, and hopefully the rest of the world aligns on that. But also in the post-market land, right? The one of the things that's been difficult, at least from my perspective, is the fact that we have varying expectations from customers. We have questionnaires that are coming in that are as part of the purchasing process, and we have varying levels of expectations of how to integrate into a hospital network. So I think that's another opportunity. Maybe we can talk about future looking later, but standardization on how device manufacturers integrate in with the ecosystem. And I think I have one more point on this. You know, I've been in medical devices in med tech for 18 years. And George, you kind of hit upon it a little bit. There's generally pushback, and when it comes to why are we spending all this money on you know, putting cybersecurity into devices? Who's ever hacked a medical device? And really, what are you combating? You're combating culture. And so I think the same way that, at least me as a previous engineer in a medical device company, as we think about safety in our medical devices, we need to think about cybersecurity the same way. And I think that's some have been the, you know, what swimming against the current has been culture and understanding what's the value. Well, the value is going to start to be compliance, right? It's not like UL or ETL certification, you get a stamp on it, says this thing's, you know, like, in that sense, electrically safe. We don't have a stamp that says this thing is cyber secure, and nor is something cyber secure today cyber secure tomorrow. And so that means there's practices happening in the background that are ensuring that we're continuously monitoring and understanding those risks. And last one, I promise, is risk management in general. We talked, you know, I heard patient safety come up. Well, 14971 isn't just about patient safety. And I think this, you know, it's about user safety as well. Our clinicians, people that are interacting with our the devices. And also the one that I think is missed is environment safety. So think about environment. So environment can be a hospital IT system. It could be the electronic medical records. Damage to those poses additional risks, both from a safety perspective, but also from an impact. So yeah, it's difficult. And then we always, when it comes to risk, we talk about the fact that we want to identify, we want to usually try to quantify it. And with cybersecurity risks, how do you quantify somebody with malicious intent? The likelihood that they're going to pivot or leverage a vulnerability in your system to do something bad. And I don't, like, we have foreseeable misuse, right, in traditional sense, but when it comes to cybersecurity, I think that's hard. It makes risk management of cybersecurity risk within your system hard, because there's a lack of what's the probability, what's the likelihood. That probably took a little longer than you wanted me to, but we had some time.
It is all good. It's a challenging space. I mean, that's great insights there. How about Jeremiah? Do you have anything to add there?
Yeah, I'll just add a few points. Dustin made a lot of great points, but I think one thing that also needs to be considered is the fact that the PHI and PII that's available in medical devices or in medtech is uniquely valuable because it allows those bad actors that collect that to work through insurance fraud, which is a very lucrative operation. So the medical records typically include a lot of financial information. So for those that are looking to do that black market sort of stuff, it's just a unique one-stop shopping location. So it becomes inherently more valuable. And so it just becomes a higher risk point because there's more interest in it trying to acquire it. But yeah, beyond that, it's as Dustin said, the complex environments, the long life cycles of products, some that were never intended to be networked are now getting networked. It all just adds to the inherent risk of the environment and complicates the situation for sure.
I think that's a challenging space. Anything else, George, for you to add to this one?
Well, I agree with both gentlemen. In fact, Dustin, you stole my tagline. You know, historically, safety is risk of shock, risk of fire, risk of mechanical hazard. Now you have a fourth risk, which is security and cybersecurity. So you brought a smile to my face on that one. But I also think that manufacturers need to take very seriously where they're storing the data, and not all cloud providers have equal security. Right? There's some that have great security, and some that security-ish, right? I think that's so. You have to understand where you're putting that data. You have to understand, is it being stolen because of insurance, or is it being stolen from malicious intent, to be determined, right? So, I think we have clients as well that the legacy products, they realize they, number one, have an unstable platform that they have their operating system, right? And that's an inherent risk unto itself. So they want to upgrade. So it is better to plan for it, to plug it in. I think, as you said, Mark. So that's something that, where you are in your journey, I go back to that because not everyone's at the same level. Not everyone has a Dustin on their staff. No offense, Dustin. But it's valid. Like when you have startup companies that are in the software as a medical device field, right? They're not looking, they haven't even launched their product yet. And they're developing a mobile application that's going to be, it's going to be used for, diagnoses, on a sensor worn by the person, whatever it may be. And, their risks are that they could have, bad code in their app that could then be, penetrated by something on a user's phone, then all that person's information stolen. So to be determined, I think that's, as technology is moving so much faster now, the risk become greater for privacy. And there's no privacy standard either, right? GDPR is very broad brushed, and it's more of an audit based perspective, and it doesn't really take into account the IoT device. There's one or two paragraphs on the smart product in GDPR, but as a manufacturer, you have to understand, as I authenticate it, what happens to my data when I authenticate on a medical device that's going to be used in home healthcare? And let's say it gets recycled. Is my data still residing on that device? Does it get scrubbed away?
Yep, I'm glad the world has you folks. This is I mean, just going, it seemed like it was no challenge whatsoever to kind of talk about, the different challenges that are in this space. And there are a lot of things and varied things, and the verification, the lack of standardization. I like Jeremiah, you brought up the fact of the sort of the nature of this data is highly valuable, and that is a lot of broad ramifications where people are trying to get to this data. Organizations who even may have the best intentions with the data, and I talked a little bit about marketing and advertising earlier, and just that there's a fine line there between what gets done and how the data is used. So great points from everybody there. So. And I think it was a good segue, George, with what you were just talking about from the data itself. So I'm interested, I want to throw this out there. So is the data really different today from, say, 5 or 10 years ago? And what I mean by that is, you have all this data that you're collecting, and really, you're collecting it to try to improve diagnosis and try to improve patient outcomes. But there's a lot of different types of data being collected, the quantities of the data that are being collected, all of that really, I mean, it brings on additional risk with things like data transfers. I was just mentioning opportunities to use the data in different ways. So is it just more data, or has there really been sort of a shift in the types of data and the uses of the data, over the last couple of years? And Jeremiah, I think we'll start with you on this one.
Yeah, and the short answer is absolutely. But and you've already touched on some of the points. The fact that there's just so much more of it, and then the pervasive connectedness of everything. We've gotten to this point where everybody just expects to be able to bring up their health data or the banking data, whatever, on your phone so that you can connect and look at your records, but also the collection of it. So we're seeing a lot of manufacturers and customers now that want to take their treatment device or their diagnostic device and connect it to the phone for collecting information. So instead of having just a lab environment where you maybe take 1 or 2 samples from a patient or maybe an overnight study, you can connect them up to a essentially a live sensor and study for a week or a month and collect a significant amount of data that's not in that stressful environment. So it's a little more natural. But then we've got this data. So what do we do with it? Some are cloud connected, so they're pushing it constantly. Some it's collected on your phone or a provided device, and then you have to go in and upload it. But when it's in any of those states, you still have to protect it. And I think somebody just mentioned, what happens if your phone gets stolen? And so there's so much more information that's just present on those devices that's vulnerable. Um, you know, Having all that information certainly provides opportunities for analytics. Uh, it just helps provide a much better experience for everybody, but that convenience brings a significant risk to it. And I think part of the trade-off is until either a manufacturer or even a customer sees a significant personal impact, they're not willing to give up that convenience. They like that convenience, they want it, and until that changes or there's really some significant impact to somebody, they're going to keep demanding it and demand more of it.
Yep. And George, any thoughts on that?
Wow. Yes. Yeah, the answer ostensibly is yes. I even just if you look at just any particular sector in the medical, and as consumers, how we use that, let alone how a physician uses it, probably more accurately how a hospital staff uses it is probably in a safer hands as they've been probably trained on how to. But if you think about the growth of telehealth and and how telehealth creates a risk for consumers, because that is your data. Your phone gets stolen, my goodness, right? I think telehealth will impact everyone but my mom because she still has a flip phone, right? But she's 84, she can do whatever she wants. So, but I think that you have to have that understanding as consumers. I always bring it back to how would it impact all of us on this call if our data was taken, if we lost our phones all at the same time and we were all using a platform, or if that platform was hacked by one person losing it, then we're all at risk. So the butterfly effect of the data growth is, it's the worst case scenario. And the really is, how do you slow that criminal down, and to put that proverbial speed bump there to slow them down so they don't have the ability to sell our personal information. And because the growth is quantum, let alone would it be sensors or 5G or whatever, topology you want to put into your device to be determined. But the growth is massive. I think we have to understand that the impact is real, and the potential impact on all of us is great.
And Dustin, anything else to add?
So totally agree with what everybody else had said there. One thing that I see too is that we're starting to feed AI models, right? And we're talking about personalized medicine, and there's this fine line of what's personal data, what's PHI versus what's not. I think it definitely. So my answer is yes as well, right? It's way different. The other thing that we're seeing too is when it comes to capital equipment, and I'll throw the robotic system, surgical robot. There's a surgeon preferences, right? And there's the need for even clinicians to want to have personal data with our medical devices and our solutions. And so it's not just the patient data that matters, it's the overall ecosystem of personal data. And obviously, and GDPR is we're talking about it's not HIPAA, it's GDPR, it's personal data, and there's a lot of implications that has, as you mentioned.
That's awesome. I mean, so insightful there. I mean, I love, Jared, you were talking about the convenience of the data brings risk. I like that terminology. As the data becomes more and more convenient, there's more and more of it. That just inevitably brings the risk. George with the butterfly effect, and that's awesome. And then Dustin, thinking about this from the broader ecosystem. It's not just the patient data. It's, the healthcare professionals. It's everybody who's interacting with these devices and the tech, and they all have preferences, and it's not just PHI. It's all sorts of personal information as well. It's so I think in a nutshell, the data is undoubtedly more. It's undoubtedly different. It's undoubtedly being used in different ways, which all brings more and more risk to sort of this data as it is flowing through its own ecosystem of patients and users and developers and support staff and all that. So, and that again, maybe within the country, maybe cross border. And sort of on that note, and kind of thinking about the word global and what that means for data transfers. So as we were kind of prepping for this, talking amongst each other, I thought that the concept of this is really interesting. So with the cloud and the backbone of the medical devices operating in the cloud, you have situations where the medical device itself may live in one geography, but the infrastructure that's supporting it is likely somewhere else entirely. How are organizations dealing with this type of data globalization, the global regulations that we keep talking about, the ability for cross-border data transfer, all those sorts of intricacies with this data and just this ecosystem of devices and backbones and data transfers. So I think with this one, George, we'll throw it to you first.
I'd like you to give me the hardest question. It's great. Well, I think that what we've seen, I'll keep it more towards what we're experiencing with device manufacturers and the regulators, as Intertech is a third-party lab, but the amount of tech files we see back or corrective actions or variance notices, whatever you want to phraseology you want to use, I always combine my knowledge into the wrong sentence, but is really cloud connectivity. We're particularly, it's like, well, do you have objective evidence that you've conducted a penetration test? And where I find certain standards have shortcomings is that they talk about the data going from the device and out, but not reaching back into the device. And the greatest risk of your data is the distance it travels. So, if you have, when you're using the cloud or a backend server, you have to understand is what is the risk that my data is secure in that cloud. Intertech, very specifically, we leverage OWASP, the top 10 OWASP security protocols, open web application security, and then we use that for mobile applications and the cloud. And that really helps supplement the testing on standards that don't have that there. So, the risk of data it's tremendous, but how you protect from a privacy perspective and a GDPR perspective, every organization is different. There's probably protocols and processes and procedures that they have, but from our perspective and a testing perspective, we want to make sure that it's, we want to try to be that, that ethical hacker, if you would. And equally, we have to tell your cloud provider that we're going to go into your environment and try to manipulate the data, because we don't want to look like we're attacking that cloud provider as well. So as ethical hacking, is what we do, we always want to err on the side of caution to make sure that you and your cloud provider know what we're going to go into your system, your architecture.
Absolutely. How about Dustin? Any thoughts there?
Yeah, to add on top of what George was talking about, one of the other things we do is just ensure good data hygiene. So if we don't need certain information, we try to anonymize the data. The other thing is always keeping track of the global regulation space, and instead of reinventing the wheel for each region or locale, right? Try to figure out what the what's the superset, and then roll it out. It makes it easier to maintain. Also, coming from a system engineering background, I would say that maintaining traceability of what's driving certain controls or requirements for how you're architecting your cloud ecosystem and your services And then really being transparent, and you mentioned it, Mark, being transparent on how we're using the data and how, when we are transferring it, what it's being used for, and understanding what's acceptable and what's not. I think that covers what I wanted to cover.
Excellent. Thanks, Dustin and Jeremiah.
Yeah, I don't have a whole lot to add to this, but I think generally what we've seen is as we work with our customers, some of them are global footprints like MedTech, and we'll work with the strategies that they have. Most will localize the data as appropriate for the various regions that they need to, and just we help them to implement their solutions. But as far as defining and working on that side of it, that's not a lot that I've had experience in. So.
Right on. And I think you all kind of touched on this too. So when I'm dealing with clients and talking about privacy and data protection high level, they often come to us and say, hey, I want to, comply with, California Consumer Privacy Act. I want to comply with Colorado's regulation. I want to comply with GDPR. That's all well and good. But at the same time, you kind of want to make sure that you're future-proofing the organization. You're kind of thinking of these concepts on a little bit of a higher level, almost raising it above a particular regulation and kind of understanding what framework and concepts kind of are the same across all of these different, privacy, cybersecurity regulations, because a lot of them are. And so if you're kind of thinking about it that way, it can kind of help on a path that isn't too narrow. Kind of, you're thinking about things a little bit more holistically and broadly. All right, so we've talked about challenges in this space. We've talked about the data and kind of why the data plays into the challenges. We talked a little bit about the globalization and kind of how that layers on additional challenges. Let's start talking about what, ways in which we can help the audience, some advice that we can give them to try to address some of the issues and concerns that we've been talking about. I mentioned earlier that I preach privacy by design and privacy by default to my clients, which again is making sure that privacy is built into the product, it's designed into the product, that it's the default that you're thinking about is to come at this stuff with that mindset. Privacy by design and default. So on the cybersecurity side, what are some key things that organizations really need to consider when developing and deploying new med tech? And this can go pretty broad. I'm interested in everybody's opinion on kind of, what have we talked about today, in terms of the challenges? What can these organizations actually do? What should they be doing? We could have done a little bit of this, but I think there's a lot here. So Dustin, why don't we start with you on this one?
So secure by design is, we have that too, right? So I think the biggest thing that I've seen is realizing that cybersecurity and cyber resiliency, I think we need to think about it as, cyber resiliency, because it's not about, if you get hacked or if something becomes vulnerable, it's about when, is we need to think about this problem, same way we do safety, right out of the gate, and as a system, right, or as a solution. And we need to, if we think about it that way, then when teams are architecting your next generation platform or your device, you're thinking the hardware team, the systems team, the software team are all working together to understand what capabilities do they need to architect in or design in as they're making a selection of a microcontroller. Fortunately in this space, IoT, aerospace, automotive have driven really good capabilities, even in simple microcontrollers and microprocessors. So I think that's one thing is think about it out of the gate. Don't, when it, early in when you're generating concepts, have product security or expertise in product security, have a seat at the table in the selection process for those new designs. The other one is don't set the bar for like what's minimum, right? Driven out of these standards. You can, for the last several years, we could kind of see the direction of where everything was headed, and we should be just doing the right thing when it comes to when it comes to risk management and cybersecurity in your devices. The more you can do in your design, the easier it is also in post-market world. And so if you have defense in depth, right? If you've chosen, a hardware root of trust, and you've built secure, secure boot on top of that, and you have secure storage, even if you might not utilize like secure storage because you don't have sensitive data that you care to protect, at least you have the building blocks there. So when marketing comes and requests some feature 2 years down the road to build on top of this already released platform, you have the capability to do it. And so I think that's the other thing to think about is, building those capabilities in out of the gate, and having scalability. The other thing is, working with, and this is again my systems engineering background coming in, collecting the stakeholder needs and the voice of the customer, because ultimately we're designing solutions to to improve outcomes within patients, to improve workflows of clinicians, to provide value to health and medicine, and across the whole world. And we need to make sure that we're listening to our stakeholders. So when I mentioned earlier, hospitals having different varying levels of requirements to connect into their systems, what do they need? What are their needs? And I think it's important for us to not just take a data point from 2001 or 2010 and say, yeah, that's where we're at, is to continuously stay in touch and with our customers. So we're driving solutions that meet their needs. And I mentioned earlier, I always like to assume that whatever is outside of the trust boundary of our device or system is to consider it hostile. I think that's a good approach. I think it causes you to shift left in solving the problem where the problem exists. The other thing that I'll add pertaining to shift left is you shouldn't need to hire Intertech or somebody to come in and point out all the problems right at the end. And in fact, if you do that, you're probably going to get pushed back and pushed into to make a decision of what's acceptable and what's not if you have a finding in a pen test, for instance. So think about tools and reviews and processes that can help support the entire risk profiling or the detection of cybersecurity risks within your product sooner, right? Because finding a problem through static code analysis, because you have a buffer overflow issue, finding it there is a lot easier to address, one, and you have time to do it, and less impactful than finding it at the last hour when you're looking to submit to a regulatory agency the next month or something. And I think that's critical. And then also shifting left, George mentioned SBOMs, so we'll talk about SBOMs. I think putting the same expectations that are being placed on us, right, to our suppliers and the vendors that we're working with, because we're not the only industry, right? There's multiple sectors, that are considered critical infrastructure, and there's a lot of critical infrastructure security concerns that are driving a lot of this legislation and regulation. But thinking about, what can we do that's part of our supplier selection or supplier contract agreements to help this whole thing help improve the way that we are assessing risk in supply chain. I think SBOMs is the start. We're going to, we talked about, I think, cybersecurity bill of materials in one of the drafts of the FDA guidance, but that was like the hardware components and the firmware that's on those. That's part of that. I think the other thing as well is understanding, and this comes from the updated guidance from the FDA, is understanding what so security controls and their effectiveness of those controls are driven by what cryptographic algorithms you're using or how much entropy you have, right? And so being mindful of the selection of controls that are effective at mitigating those problems. I think we have another conversation later on about forward-looking topics, and I'm not going to jump there, but I think those things are, in general, very important.
It's really, really good advice, Dustin. Thank you. Jeremiah, I know you have a unique perspective on this too. So any thoughts again, what are the, top things that you want the folks on this call to kind of take away from when they're considering this stuff?
Yeah, I think there's, and Dustin kind of touched on some of these already, but I think there's three kind of major mindsets that need to start shifting in the industry and in implementers as they're working on it. And one that we've already touched on is security is not an afterthought. It needs to be thought about upfront, and it needs to be through the entire life cycle of the product. It needs to be integral to the designs, to when you're selecting hardware, as Dustin said, perhaps you need a TPM so that you can have secure storage of the keys or any other secrets that you might need to be storing away in the device. And just as you're going through the development, setting the requirements, determining what sort of security algorithms do we need, looking at the hardware design, maybe there's some exposed interfaces, USB or whatever, that maybe don't need to be. So let's just remove those. And so helping to secure it as you're going through it, so that when you get to the end, as he said, if you're in a penetration test or maybe even submitting for your 510K, and then they bounce you back, like, it's incredibly expensive to fix. And either just in the implementation cost of it or schedule cost. If you get bumped back by the FDA and now you got to come back for a new submission, that's time to market, and that can get very expensive. So just making sure that security is always in the mind of the developers and in the product developers, and keeping it always in the forefront. It's not something that we can just turn on at the end. Another, I think, big point that really needs to be made is cybersecurity doesn't stop when the product ships. Like, once you hit manufacturing, cybersecurity is still a concern and still needs to be thought about, because even though the product may not be changing, the environment that it lives in does change. So we need to continually be aware that there's changes in the environment, maybe some of that soup code that's out there. The OS now has a vulnerability. I think everybody on this call is probably well aware of Log4j and the impacts that had. So just remaining aware of those types of things is really critical. And I had a third point and I've forgotten it. So
That's awesome.
anyway, yeah.
Good stuff. And George, I'm sure you have some things to say on this topic also.
Yeah, I agree with Dustin and Jared.
I do too.
Yeah, I don't know. I think that it's very valid, right? I did a discussion years ago with Dr. Schwartz of the FDA, and her tagline was "Plan for it, don't plug it in," right? And that really, paraphrasing what Dustin was advocating for. I think you have to have some type of plan, and Jared is 100% right to really kind of summarize. It is not a static. It's a test report is static, right? It's a moment in time, and you have to have. And I've used the analogy that if you're modifying your software throughout the year, like, what's your plan to revalidate that in a year? It's akin to going to the dentist, right? We all get yelled at for not flossing, right? Let's cut.
Oh, I remember my last point.
Yeah, there you go.
I think Dustin touched on it. It's the mentality of, the minimum. Let's check the box. Let's do the minimum to get through whatever we need for submissions. We need to really start pushing past that and do what's right, what's going to be appropriate. Make sure that we're thinking far enough ahead so that when the environment does change, that we're prepared and ready to adapt to it.
Right.
And I'm going to piggyback off of because I had another point that I wanted to make a point of. We talked about. Sorry, George. We talked about transparency when it comes to data privacy. I think one of the key things, at least in building trust in both, with the HDOs and regulators, is being transparent about what we're doing for cybersecurity, both process and controls, and both in pre-market and in post-market, to build trust in those with our customers or those stakeholders. And I think that's critical too. And it's something that I think we're not accustomed to, especially when it comes to regulators of, FDA, for instance, with FDA, like, hey, we could only do this much with the technology that was built in, and this is how we're rationalizing acceptability versus the clinical outcome and benefit. And I think having that transparency in there is key. I talked to Matt Hazlett and Jessica Wilkerson from the FDA when I was at DEF CON. Yeah, the FDA was at DEF CON this year in Biohacking Village. One of the key things they've mentioned in previous talks and also then was be transparent. They're learning too, regulators are learning too. And, at the end of the day, understanding that we're thinking about it and we're taking actions to move it in the right direction is what they care about.
And
Yeah,
I'll parlay off that comment too, Dustin. I think that you said something about the FDA, it's very critical, and it's critical for all, because everyone's in a different part of their journey. If you have a question that you may not even be ready to do greater than, right? Which it's always do better to do greater than, but ask the regulator, what do you think I should do, right? Ask them, because they do want that transparency. And you made a funny comment, when you get to Intertech, we do the front end too. We're not just a pretty face, right? So we tell clients that ask the FDA at a minimum what you should do, but you should do greater than, right? Because it evolves every day. There's the environment change, to Jeremiah's point, so, but if you're not sure what you need to do centric to the FDA, I would ask them.
Great points. Excellent. So to keep things rolling here, before we get to the Q&A, we have a lot of good questions actually queued up for the Q&A, so that's awesome. But one of the things I was most excited about for this panel is to kind of talk about the future and see what, we'll do a quick round robin here about what are your predictions for either the next big data protection or cybersecurity challenge in medtech, or the next big something in medtech, the next big something along the lines of what we've been talking about here. So pretty open-ended, but always love to get people's perspective on how the future might look. So for this one, why don't we start with Jeremiah?
all right. I think we're on the cusp of one right now. I mean, AI is such a huge conversation point right now, and it's becoming revolutionary in the industry. But it also brings a lot of risk with it. I mean, as we're using AI to develop code, to test code, that's great. It's going to improve efficiency of developers, probably improve the quality of the code that's going out there. But that also brings with it the fact that a lot of code, a lot of data, the handling of it's going to become very homogeneous, very similar. And that's a double-edged sword. When you've got things that are very consistent, they're usually very well tested, pretty robust. But when everybody's the same, and then when an issue is found, it just becomes all the more cataclysmic. Again, back to the Log4j thing. Everybody was using Log4j, and now there's an issue. So now we've got impacts across just so much more threat space. So I think AI and just how it's implemented is definitely going to have an impact on how we're dealing with cybersecurity. And of course, there's the flip side. There's, now there's the AI that's being used to generate code to hack and to the online, just the malicious intent. So that there's just a lot going on with AI, and it's really going to become pretty revolutionary. And then secondary, probably a little farther out, just as genetic data and, the 23andMe and all this, as that becomes digitized, I think that is becoming a new, probably interesting point of PHI that has some implications that haven't even been considered yet.
Excellent. Thank you, Jeremiah. I think we'll roll to you, George, next, and then we'll finish out with Dustin.
Jeremiah stole my thunder. AI. AI in a lot of areas that, I think the one area AI that is not only, how quickly you can churn out content, right? That's a tremendous concern. But I think that, it can replicate your voice if you go into home healthcare very centrically, and you have devices that are voice activated. If someone can replicate my horrific Boston accent, then they're into, everything that I own. So I think that is a huge issue. And I bring it back to the consumer, because it makes it, I think, an easier area to kind of wrap your head around. I think the concept of cybersecurity is such a broad concept for a lot of manufacturers, but as it relates to their device, it is their criticality is at their device level. So that's where they have to understand what is my risk, and wow, we're going to have this, the next slick thing is going to have voice recognition, so the surgeon can come in and say good morning, and it's going to fire up the device and authenticate it, and he can talk into his phone, so he can then communicate back, and whatever it may be, right? Whatever that future beholds, but AI, 100%.
So my turn. So I'm going to play off of AI because I think you guys missed one. What about if AI is used to penetration test and hack into environments? I think we're going to see an uptick of AI generated attack methods, and I think that I don't know if we're ready for that. And I've seen, for instance, I was just looking on GitHub. There's a pen test GPT, right? It starts there. It's already writing code. It already understands interfaces, and so that's the next thing I think we have to worry about. But if you build defense in depth and you do fuzz testing on interfaces and things like that, I think you have a better assurance of the cybersecurity risks, risk profile of your device. The other one that I don't look forward to, because I know that certain algorithms that are implemented in devices today will be broken, is quantum, right? I think in the next couple of decades, I'm not going to predict anything, but we need to worry about the next, what is effective cybersecurity controls for threats that exist today and tomorrow. We don't have that I know about. There might be some state and governments that have this capability, but the ability to break some of the what's considered secure crypto functions of today. And so I think we need to, the next thing will be quantum safe algorithms that are already being recommended by agencies like NIST.
Fascinating stuff. I got goosebumps when you're talking about the AI generated attacks and stuff. Just thinking about that concept from a bunch of different directions is both scary and interesting. So, all right, thank you guys so much. That was really cool. We do have some time set aside here for Q&A. We do have a bunch of questions. I think what I will do, I will just I'll read them, I'll throw them out there. Whoever among the three of you wants to kind of jump in first, we can kind of just deal with them that way and kind of talk through it. So I'm going to start with the oldest first, and let's see here. So, is the threat detection analysis imposed by the FDA for design and validation only? Will there be any requirements to test each manufactured device? So is the threat detection analysis imposed by the FDA for design validation only, or will there be any requirements to test each manufactured device?
So George, I think that was directed to you.
Yeah, it was.
first.
I was hoping. I was curious about how a manufacturer answer that, but my opinion is that when you look at your portfolio of products, you really have to understand that you're not going to. It's not feasible to test every single one. So when you look at your threat, and you have common architecture, you have common. What's the commonality? I think Dustin hit on this earlier about when we're talking about the a global approach is what's the economies of scale. So if you're using Android only app and you're using a certain Wi-Fi chipset, that's you're not going to have to test every single one because the ecosystem is predefined.
Yeah, I'll echo that, I guess. So typically manufacturing test, it's verifying that the product was put together correctly. So it's more of a hardware test. Whereas what the FDA is looking for, and particularly for cybersecurity, is have you designed it in a means that's going to be resilient? So, and that's not something that's going to change as they're assembled.
Yeah, and I would add, there are multiple different signals that indicate threat, right? maybe, and one thing that I didn't mention previously, and I meant to for my friend V, was logging and detection, right? Some things that we haven't necessarily done well within medical devices is actually implement logging and detection of security related events. And I think in the post-market space, that also poses problems from a what devices were impacted by this or potentially impacted by this event. If you have zero logging, you're gonna have to assume more than the quantity of the event that created that you're investigating, right? You might, for instance, if there was some data confidentiality type of vulnerability in a system, you might have to assume that it might have impacted more than just that single device where this was first detected. The other one is I'm thinking threat detection is a broader category probably than that Clayton, the person that asked the question, intended, but threat detection can also be that there's there's new methods, attack methods that were not considered in your original pen test, right? And so what types of signals drive additional activities by the manufacturer to ensure that they understand the risks and the implications of those risks on their devices?
Great, thank you all. That's great. All right, so moving on to the next one. We kind of hit on this a little bit, but there's a specific question in here. So how does the integration of machine learning and medical devices impact cybersecurity concerns? Do you think that the guidance and standards existing today are sufficient, or will new ones be needed? That's interesting. So throwing that out to the group.
I think that I just knowing where the FDA has driven guidance after the cybersecurity guidance as an example, right? They've, the original cybersecurity guidance came out in 2014. I can't remember when the AI ML guidance came out, but I would anticipate, and this is another area that regulators are learning alongside of the manufacturers, that we'll see changes in those expectations as well. And so not being an expert in AI or ML, I would just consider looking at the underlying intent that in the direction that the guidance and standards are going to set the bar for tomorrow before they set the bar. But yeah, I anticipate a lot of changes there.
I actually agree. I think this is the unknown of the future, right? And I think that's where collectively, the regulators are probably you think about the decade they worked on just getting the final draft guidance out of the FDA. Now they have this new area of AI, new area of machine learning they have to take into consideration. So I think it's the evolution that will occur. When that will happen, to be determined.
Mm-hmm. Kind of interesting, the analog there in the data privacy space too. As these new states come on board, 12 states now, there's 6 more kind of being considered. It's just very interesting how the timing of this stuff, and they're all staggered with their start dates and everything. So it's I think cybersecurity, privacy, data protection generally is a very dynamic space. And I think, certainly the guidelines and standards need to kind of, continue along with especially considering all the challenges that we all talked about today in this space. So we hit on a little bit about AI and machine learning. So we have a question. This is very specific, but I'm interested in everybody's thoughts on it. So with advancements in AI and ML, including adaptive algorithms, how frequently should cybersecurity testing be assessed? It's maybe I'll stop. I'm biting my tongue, and I'm interested to see what.
It depends.
Yeah, it depends. I think I'll throw out there because every manufacturer is different resources. Depends on what resources you have internally. It depends on how much, if you don't have the resources internally, you have to go to a third party, what your budget is. It really depends. Best practices, again, it really depends on if you're building it securely, and that should be robust enough to be, equal to or greater than, to Dustin's comments earlier, but depends is probably the strongest answer I can give. Probably not
And
the answer people want.
yeah, it would add, it comes back to your risk assessment. What's going to be the
Agreed.
impact if there is some sort of violation of the system?
Yep, good points. Good points. All right. Let's see. Okay. What do you suggest the strategy for cybersecurity analysis should be? And they list a couple options. So what do you suggest the strategy for cybersecurity analysis should be? In-house, owned by SQA, or outsourced? And again, probably a similar answer to the last question, but we'll throw it.
So I think so. I'll take this one. And you feel free to add more, but in-house versus outsourced. I think at the end of the day, right? In-house, you own, you're accountable, right? And so regardless of who's performing the analysis, you own it, and you need to make sure that you're doing the right things. And like I mentioned earlier, doing those things sooner are going to drive better, higher quality, secure devices later. And also, there was another question that was asked on what do you recommend for firmware cybersecurity analysis, which I'll just say, much like the previous question before, it depends, because what's the objective? Because for static, for instance, static analysis or even dynamic analysis, you do that for different reasons. What is your objective in doing that? Are you trying to find secrets in your firmware? Are you trying to create an SBOM? Are you trying to determine if your software is, meeting some coding standard? What is your software written in? What platform does it exist on? Are you using package managers? Is it, based on C++? Is it Android? Is it .NET? Is it Go, Rust, right? That matters because there's tons of tools out there today. And I would say there's a lot of good open source tools, and start there first. None of them are perfect, and none of them are good at all of those things. And so focus on what the objective is. And back to your original question, SQA, that's software QA. I'm assuming, I'll mention at like I mentioned at the beginning, this isn't a software problem. This is a systems problem. For instance, I reside and report to a VP of our system COE. The product security team is part of R&D, and we partner with quality, regulatory, software, core system engineering. Within Medtronic, I think we're one of the only medical device manufacturers that has product security reporting up through corporate QA. So from a governance perspective, I think having some disconnect there from the product, from the portfolio teams is important. And going back to what George was saying, what is independent? I think for a smaller team or a smaller company, you have a harder time if you're working on one device to show that you're truly independent from that, versus a larger corporation like Medtronic that does have enough layers in separation to possibly prove that. So
Yeah, I think you hit on some good points there, Dustin. But I would suggest that maybe it's not an either or, but it's both. I think there's roles that your internal can certainly take on, that whole shift left, but also you need some of that outside party or that third party for the independence, the point that you just made there, Dustin, because the challenge that can happen over time is that as you have an internal team and they get used to working with the developers, even though there's somewhat of a firewall, they still get used to doing things kind of the same way, and the tunnel vision will develop over time. So you need that unique, fresh perspective every now and then to think outside the box and say, well, have you considered that somebody might try this? Like, oh, no, we didn't. So that's really critical when in cybersecurity, because that's really what the issue is all about, is somebody is abusing the system in a way that wasn't intended. So
I think that's well articulated by both gentlemen. I'm not going to say outsourced is the answer. By the way, as an independent third party lab, I think that it is, there is a nature that you have to have pride of ownership of your cybersecurity as a manufacturer. How you validate that, how you have the validation of your efforts, that's large corporations may have a check and balance, small manufacturers may not. So it depends on your organization. There's no perfect answer, but it's certainly the pride of ownership has to start with the manufacturer, and that's where the responsibility starts from a cybersecurity perspective, is with you.
That is fantastic, and I mean, great advice. I think we're kind of approaching the end here. So, gentlemen, thank you so much, Dustin, Jeremiah, George, for your time and expertise today. Amazing discussion. Truly appreciate your willingness to share your insights and solutions and predictions, especially. Again, that's typically my favorite part. It was awesome. Big thank you to the audience for attending. We hope everybody got something out of the session today. Of course, please don't hesitate to reach out if you have any questions or like any more information on anything we've discussed today. I think I saw that Nicole put in the chat that the slides will be available. You have the recording from this. Feel free to reach out to any of us. We'd be happy to connect. And finally, a big thank you to Massmedic, for the platform, the venue here. Great organization. I think I speak for everybody, look forward to continued collaboration and partnership with Massmedic. So thanks again, everyone, and I will turn it back over to Nicole for some closing remarks.
Wonderful. Thank you so much, guys. Awesome conversation. I'm sure we could keep going. Tons to talk about, and lots, things that, like Mark said, are kind of scary to think about. So glad we have all you guys. Like you guys kept doing, Mark, you stole some of my talking points. Thank you. Thank you so much. But seriously, thank you for your time today and expertise. Really appreciate your sponsorship, Intertech, BDO, and Benchmark. Thank you. We can't put on great programs like this to help our members without support from folks like you. Thank you, Dustin, for joining us as well from Medtronic. And I encourage you to go to massmedic.com and check out all of the other great events we have coming up. We do have a few others on this related topic on cybersecurity regulations, including our regulatory roundup on November 15th, which is in person at KPMG in Boston, or there is a virtual option where George and team are going to be presenting again, probably a little more in depth about cybersecurity regulations, if that's something you want to pick his brain about. You'll also have a chance to hear from Troy Tazbaz. He's the new Director of Digital Health Center of Excellence at the FDA. So check it out. Again, thank you everybody for attending, and thank you to our speakers. Have a great day.